Hello, we're here, well, I'm here, I'm Donald Forrester, Professor of Social Work at Cascade. I'm here interviewing Kayleigh Llewellyn. Hello, Kayleigh.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's my pleasure. I must admit I'm a bit more nervous than I usually am, because usually we do talks about social work issues, but we're actually interviewing you about the TV series In My Skin, which you wrote. And I suppose I need to start by saying I'm just a huge fan of it. I think it's just a brilliant TV series. But we particularly wanted to talk to you because there's a lot of issues that are sort of relevant to social work and other people who might be working with children and families. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Pleasure, and I'm so glad to hear you like the show. It means a lot.
So I know that you have previously talked about the fact that the program is based on your own experiences growing up. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that.
About my experiences?
Yeah, to what degree is the show sort of based on, as far as you want to tell us, on things that happened to you?
Well, I always say it's heavily autobiographical, but it's not a documentary. It's not an excerpt from my diary. In TV you sort of always have to just go with whatever is the best story, and sometimes that's close to my real life and sometimes it's made up. So it's kind of a blending of the two, but there's a lot of truth in there.
Brilliant. I think before we started recording, I said the problem is I treat it almost as a documentary, and obviously it is a piece of fiction, and you may need to point that out to me from time to time. And one of the things I wanted to start off with is the central character is Bethan, this young woman who's, I guess, 16, 17 at the start. It strikes me she really lives in two very distinct worlds. One's at home and one's at school. To what degree do you think it was important for her to keep the two separate? And I suppose to what degree is it positive that she keeps the two separate?
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. And this is where, you view the TV show as a documentary, and I'll talk about it and blur the show in my real life because it is so blended. I think it is important for Bethan in some ways and negative in some ways. The negative aspect is that because she draws this really clear line between her home life and her school life, tries to keep them completely separate, she is living with kind of a deep amount of shame, which is damaging and toxic and not good for anyone to live with. And it also means that she can't ever ask for help because she's hiding everything so deeply. No one knows there's a problem, and therefore she's left to deal with it alone. So she never gets to feel the kind of life-affirming sort of soul rehabilitation that comes from having someone else go, oh yeah, me too. That happens to lots of people. It's not only you. She never gets that. Flip side, the positive aspect of keeping them separate is she has this positive, joyful place to go to where she's not marred by the stuff that's going on at home, where she just gets to be free and independent and a person in her own right. And so whereas a lot of kids kind of hate school, Bethan and I kind of love it. Loved it. You get to go there and just be someone of your own creation. So there's good parts and bad parts, I think.
Absolutely. And in the TV program, that's one of the things that works really well. Like in one scene, she may be larking around with her friends or agonizing about, someone she fancies or something, and then she'll go home and something really terrible or dramatic has happened, and the contrast is very, very striking. I guess there's a couple of questions I want to ask now. One is in terms of professionals or people who might have helped her, who might have been able, as a social worker, I loved it, and I realized that having a social worker come in to sort out all the problems is not good for the drama and possibly not very accurate, but it did leave me wondering, what could or should people do to spot and help kids who might be in situations like that, do you think?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because, so first of all, I was a teenager in late 90s and early noughties, so it's quite a different landscape, I imagine, to how things would be in a school now. My biggest fear growing up was that a social worker would become involved in my life. One, because I had the feeling that if a social worker was involved, I would simply be taken away from my mum. I didn't know that there was a different level of involvement. It was like, if they know, you'll be taken away.
Yeah.
Which I didn't want, and probably isn't the reality of the situation, but as a kid, that's what you think. I also would not have wanted the stigma, like the feeling, because I was so afraid that this information would get out to my peers. The idea that a social worker might be involved makes it even more likely that this news might get out, and how much more damning that would be. I thought anyway. So maybe that boils down to sort of, yeah, I wish I'd known more about it, more than I sort of maybe just saw on the odd drama on TV of what it is for a social worker to be involved. I wish I'd known more about what roles a social worker can fulfill, and how they might have been able to help. In terms of what people could have done to help me, I think, well, around mental health, when my mum, on the many occasions my mum was sectioned, and I was obviously clearly a child in those environments with her. Her first full nervous breakdown that I can remember, she had one when I was a baby, and then the next one was when I was 11 years old. And so I was in the mental hospital with her a lot as an 11-year-old by myself. And no one ever took me aside to explain what was happening to my mum.
Right.
And you can't when it comes to mental health, nurses, they're already so thinly spread. So I can't be like, well, they weren't doing their job or something, because they're not babysitters. But I wish someone had explained to me my mum's illness, because I'm still learning about it now as an adult, and my family didn't understand bipolar. My wider family didn't understand it. My mum probably doesn't fully understand her illness either. So no one ever said, this is what's going on, this is how long she might be here, this is what's happening to her brain. No one ever said, how come you're here by yourself? Which is probably quite a red flag, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So people weighing in then to explain and help with that. My teachers at school didn't know about my mum's mental health issues, so they couldn't have weighed in. I don't, it's hard looking back. In my head at the time, I thought I'm doing a really good job and no one has a clue what's going on. In hindsight, I don't think that's true. I think a lot of my friends knew there were issues.
Oh really?
Yeah, I don't think they knew exactly what, but I don't think I was as good a liar as I thought I was. And I remember I had a teacher in primary school. I don't know what she had seen or observed, because I was too young, but as an adult looking back, you go, oh, there was something there. She asked me to stay behind after class when I was 7. And she gave me a pair of roller skates that were her daughter's that she'd grown out of. And she gave me them in a carrier bag and said, don't tell anyone, you can have these. So I always think, gosh, she must have known. Why did I need a pair of roller skates? And the same teacher, sort of a few months later, same again, asked me to stay behind. And she gave me like a collection of leather-bound Enid Blyton books, the famous 5. And wow. I just thought my mind was blown, and I'll never forget that teacher, and I'll never forget those moments. But clearly that teacher had observed something. But that's the only time I remember people weighing in any way.
So that's incredibly powerful, and it shows how even relatively small acts of kindness and noticing can be really important, I guess. When did you begin to understand bipolar then? How did you begin to understand it if no one was sort of explaining it to you?
I think growing my own understanding as a teenager, the more my mum was sectioned, we kind of had the internet then, but not in the way that, I knew to go on Google and research something. So I learned to understand the rhythms of her illness just from being near it, like what mania would look like. Because mania doesn't always tip over into a breakdown. Obviously, mania might just be suddenly she was up at 7 a.m. cleaning the whole house. And I'd see that and go, okay, something's going on here. Or if she took to her bed, she used to do that a lot when I was younger. She just kind of needed to sleep a lot. Not always, but suddenly in bursts, she'd just not want to get up. And she was never up in the morning when I was up. You know, I always got myself dressed and made myself breakfast, no matter how young I was. And I just assumed that was normal. And then as I got a bit older, I started to realize, oh no, this comes in a rhythm around when she gets sick. So yeah, it probably wasn't until I moved to London when I was 20, 21 that I started to research it a bit more, saw a couple of documentaries about it. It's partly why I made In My Skin, is because for me as a kid, the most powerful tool to understand what was going on with my mum would have been to have watched a TV show, because I wasn't going to sit down and read a book on bipolar. And I wasn't going to read a kind of medical study, you know, I was a kid, but I did watch telly. And so, yeah, that would have been the best way for me to quickly understand it. So, yeah, I think Stephen Fry had a documentary and things like that. And then, yeah, just becoming older and having more faculties and realizing that I can research it and I can speak to doctors myself and grow an understanding. But yeah, it wasn't really until an adult.
That must have been incredibly difficult to make sense of then. If you're a child and your mother's got these different behaviors and you can't really see a logic to them, or was it just your normal world and you just took it for granted?
I think my normal world was chaos. So it wasn't specifically just around bipolar. It was, I think, any kid from a family who has a parent who's an addict, who's abusive, and my mum being mentally ill, and you know, we didn't have any money either, so there was that chaos always thrown in of bailiffs knocking the door and stuff. My day-to-day was just, don't feel safe, don't assume that anything around you is a given, that it can't be taken away from you, don't assume that you are safe. So I was already operating on that. As I say, my mum didn't have a breakdown until I was 11, but my dad was abusive and an alcoholic, and we had no money prior to that. So I already knew that was all I knew, basically. So it just sort of fed into that overall feeling.
Despite all these, well, actually, no, I wanted to ask about something. I want to ask about how Bethan and perhaps yourself were so resilient in such difficult circumstances. But you mentioned something earlier that you were afraid of being taken into care. And I guess there are many people, and maybe many social workers, who would look at Bethan's situation and think, well, maybe she should be in care. Maybe that would be the best thing for her. If she, and I guess what I want to ask what your thoughts are on that. And if she wasn't going to go into care, how could she be helped to stay in a family where there are a lot of difficulties, to put it mildly?
I had, in my own instance and in Bethan's instance, I had a grandmother who was fantastic. And in hindsight, what would have happened if social workers had become involved is that they might have said, go and live with your nan full time. I wouldn't have had to have gone to a stranger. So it would have been good if I'd have understood that at the time, that I could have gone to a family member. In terms of kind of resilience, I think part of it is something you're born with, which isn't helpful probably in terms of like what social workers can do to help kids. But I think there are some kids who are able to have a slightly thicker skin and rise above it, and there are some kids who are more deeply traumatized by it. And I said, you know, I'm one of 4 in reality, and I know I'm the only one who was able to rise above it a little bit more. I see the ways it really deeply and lastingly hurt my siblings. And I can't say that's something I learned or was taught. I think I just came out of the womb with that. But things that I can look back and see them as like, you know, those things help me. Something as small as, we had a library really near my house, and my mum always used to take us to rent books out like a couple of times a week, and being able to read books and other worlds and other characters really quickly exposed me to the fact that, one, my situation wasn't normal, which I might not have realized as early if it wasn't for that. But also the flip side of that is that, well, therefore I can aspire to more. This isn't all there is, because I can see these worlds where other things are happening. So just being exposed to other ways of life was really integral to me. And then talking about my grandmother and my mum too, you know, obviously my mum suffered with bipolar, but she also adored me. And my grandmother adored me. And I think there is a lot to be said for me. I won't generalize, speaking for me growing up, walking into a room where my grandmother's face lit up when she saw me and she told me I was special, it counted for so much. And then going to school and having, I don't think, as I said, I don't think most of my teachers fully understood what was going on at home, but teachers who took an interest, you know, because as Bethan becomes in series 2 of In My Skin, I did get gobby and I did become, you know, naughty, and they didn't just write me off as a troublemaker. You know, the ones who would pull you aside and have a one-on-one chat with you and made me feel like a grown-up who they trusted. Do you know what I mean? Not like a teacher talking down to a kid, but someone going, come on, let's have this out. Why are you doing this? Because you could be A-grade material, so why are you not? You know, those are the things that I look back and see made a difference. And finding drama, you know, it's the most support. I think every school has a drama department where all the kind of waifs and strays wash up. And certainly in my school, the drama department, doing plays and community, that's a way to boil it down. Being part of a team, which you are if you put a play on.
Right.
Just, I don't know, it just made me feel like I'd found my people.
That's brilliant. And I wondered also whether humour, a sense of humour is part of it, because one of the real things, we've talked a lot about the difficult issues, but one of the real things about In My Skin is it's also really funny, often very soon after or just before some drama, or even as bad things are happening, there's kind of, there can be laughter in the darkness. And I wondered, is that because that was part of it?
My cat is going to keep screaming until I let her out.
That's fine, that's fine.
Sorry, carry on.
I wonder whether the drama was an integral part of the story, or whether it's something you thought needed to be there because otherwise it would be very different. It makes it much more watchable, having both. And I guess I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but is the drama an integral part of it, or something you felt had to be added to it?
I think it's both what my real life was, and it's also, as a consumer of TV, what I like to watch, if that makes sense. Make them laugh, make them cry kind of feeling. I think there's something I observe about watching dramas about benefit class people, or people who are living in poverty, council estates, you know, or the lower end of working class. For me, it's always evident when that's been written by someone who isn't from that life themselves, because they turn it into this kind of dour, everything's awful, misery for 60 minutes solid. And it feels like poverty porn. Whereas growing up in that environment, I know that actually it was really funny. I think sometimes like adversity breeds a good sense of humor. That's how we as people oftentimes get through. I think it's never all miserable. And when you're living in it, you certainly growing up, I didn't necessarily know that it wasn't anything but normal. So why would I be sad all the time? So I remember growing up around funny people. Like I had an auntie who just was like the biggest joker. And same goes to my nan. And there was always laughter. Even my dad, for all of his bad qualities, if anyone were, my father passed away in 2015, but if any of his friends were to describe him, the first thing they would say is he was the funniest guy in the room, you know? So I grew up around comedy, and then very quickly, I think a lot of kids who are hiding something or are worried about being bullied develop a keen sense of humor, because it's the best defense to deflect people's attention away from you. So growing up, I was always that was it. I was the funny one. And laughter's got me through, basically, it's been my best friend. It's got me through every bad situation. And even now I can laugh about anything quite quickly. I think my partner sometimes, Emily, is like, I don't know, when I'm immediately cracking jokes about something, I see her looking at me being like, but are you okay? I'm like, yeah, this is how you become okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I put that in the show because that's who I am and that's how my life has been. I also don't like anything. I just think if TV is completely dour for the entire time, if you had 30 minutes of unrelenting trauma, people might think, oh God, that's a good show. It's well acted and it's well written, but I can't bear to watch it again. It's too painful.
Yeah.
So you've got to sweeten the pill, I think, to make it bearable.
I read Shuggie Baines as I was watching series 2 of In My Skin, and it's got a lot of similar issues, but there's no humor. It's just, I don't know if you've read it. It's
No.
I mean, it's really brilliant. I did read it and think this is a brilliant book, but it was unremitting gloom and doom. It's just awful.
I was going to read it over Christmas, and Emily was like, I don't think you should for Christmas.
Yeah.
Right? But I've heard it's fantastic.
It is fantastic, but it is a bit like In My Skin without the jokes, I think. a bit. I mean, that's not doing it justice, but anyway. One of the things I wondered is, In My Skin set in Wales, in Cardiff, and do you think it is particularly a Welsh story, or do you think it's a story that could be anywhere in the UK and maybe other places? I don't know.
I think it can be anywhere in the world. I think the universal themes of shame, and having a complicated relationship with the person you love most, also being the person who you are most ashamed of and who causes you the most pain. I think a lot of kids can say that about their parents. So in that sense, I think it's entirely universal. But then I also wanted to be specific. There's small things, but I wanted it to be specific to the mental health system in Cardiff. We didn't speak to an English-based mental health doctor for research. We have a Cardiff-based one because it is, of course, different to England and other places in the world. So there is some uniqueness in that sense, but on the whole, it can happen to anyone.
That's brilliant. I just wanted to ask a couple more practical questions, really, which is, you've become a writer from a very difficult background, and it strikes me there's lots of kids in the care system who could be fantastic writers. They've often got amazing stories to tell, but it's not an obvious career. How do you become a writer? How and also for professionals, how could you support people who are interested in drama or writing or directing or any of these areas? I don't know whether, as someone who's at least begun to make it in that area, you'd have any advice or tips for people.
Yeah, I think that thing of if you can't see it, you can't be it is so true. And I began writing not late in life, but later. I didn't start writing until I was about 26, 27, I think, because I simply didn't know it was a job before that. So, and the other thing I should say is, when I began writing, I certainly didn't begin writing my own stories because it wasn't something I was, one, ready to be honest about, but two, thought that the middle class people I was meeting in the media would understand. So I kind of, was burying that down. And actually, the moment I did strike upon In My Skin was the first time I had real success as a writer. But it took me a while to realize that my honest story would resonate with people because I didn't believe it was interesting. It wasn't what I was seeing on TV, and I didn't think there was a currency to it. So I suppose the biggest message I have for young kids, maybe with a similar life to mine, is your story is so important, and you telling it, you being the one to tell your story, is even more important. And even if it's become boring to you because you've lived with it for 18 years, it's still really fascinating someone else who doesn't know any of it yet. So I think know that, first of all. On a practical level, it's a hard industry to break into if you have no money, because you have to work for free or for very little money for quite a while you build up contacts and try to get an agent and everything else. So practically, money is how you help people from that background get into this job, whether that be paid internships or bursaries. There was a period of time where I was writing Casualty. So I'd already kind of, I had an agent and I was writing a primetime BBC One show. But because I had to become a writer, I had to run up like 3 credit cards, just living on credit cards so that I could work for free, and kind of go into that recklessly. And probably the fact that I'd never had any money meant that I didn't care. I was like, well, I'll run up debt because I've never had any money. So why would I care about continuing to not have any money? So I was in that position already, writing Casualty. So, on the surface doing well. And then I had this year of a lot of loss in my family. 6 family members died in a year from 2015 to 2016. And so that meant 6 funerals, and 6 funerals cost loads of money. And I was having to help out to pay for them, and also not being able to work as much because I was, grieving. And there's no buffer zone, or if you're in that position, you can't fall ill, you can't spend cash, like there's just nothing. So it just gutted my finances, and I very nearly had to quit the industry. And it was only because this charity, the film and television charity, they're called, someone at BAFTA told me about them, and I went to them, and a person came out to my home, and they look at your finances, they look at all your bank statements, and they just gave me cash. They kept me afloat for 6 months, and they paid my rent. And that's how I'm still writing now. Otherwise I would have had to quit. So money is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
There are various schemes though. There are like writing competitions was my way in, because if you've got a good ear for dialogue and you've got some good stories to tell, you don't have to be a fantastic writer yet. So I think it's good to know that just because you're coming into it and maybe you're not as experienced or seemingly educated as other people, doesn't matter. If you've got some good story to tell and a good ear, everything else can be taught. So do the writing competitions. They sometimes cost, but most of them will do fee waivers for people from low paid backgrounds. And then there's shadow schemes, things BBC run shadow schemes for Casualty, Doctors, EastEnders, where you get paid a sort of small amount, but you come and they teach you how to write scripts. Channel 4 do them as well. Soho Theatre. I mean, there's tons of them which I can send you. I've got a list of them which I can send you after if it's handy to have on file. But I think just maximizing those schemes that are available and knowing that your voice is important.
Thank you so much. There's one more question which I wasn't sure, or area I wanted to explore. So I've sort of left it slightly in the wrong order because I think we may edit it separately. And that was really about sort of domestic abuse and addiction and the father. So we've talked about the effect of bipolar. But what do you think? And I suppose I'm struck that at the heart of the drama, there are these 3 amazing women going through difficulties, but with a really strong bond with one another. Bethan, her mother, and actually her mother-in-law. And then there's her father, who without any spoilers, he does a lot of bad things, and is a very difficult, troubled person. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about his relationship with Bethan and how addiction may have affected that, I guess, is what I'm what I've been thinking about.
Well, Dilwyn in the show and my own father, to blur the lines again, obviously there's a lot of crossover. I think my dad was mentally ill too, but the difference being he would never have gone to the doctors and asked for help in the way my mum did. So in a way, I sort of see Dilwyn and my own father as having been a kind of sickness of the patriarchy, to put it that way. And talk about how the patriarchy serves no one, but particularly it does a disservice to men. seemingly you watch the show and you think that man has all the power, but in reality I think my father was the most miserable of us all. So held back by the ideas of what he should be to be a strong man, and just poisoned by that. And he died a very miserable, sad man alone. So as I say, I do think he was mentally ill. I think he'd probably, I don't know what I would class it as. I've had a therapist before say she thinks he had split personality disorder. If he could have gone to seek help when he was much younger, maybe he would have been a different person. He certainly wasn't evil. And I think sometimes on TV you see domestic abusers depicted as monsters, and it doesn't necessarily serve us at all, because oftentimes if we tell people that someone who might be domestically violent is a monster, then we all think, oh, then I don't know anyone who's domestically violent because I don't know any really clearly obvious monsters. And actually the reality is oftentimes far more nuanced, and it's, can be, and it's not exclusive to men, of course, either. There are women who do it too, but it can be the person who, in the office who seems like a funny, nice guy. As I said, everyone thought my dad was the funniest man they knew. They didn't necessarily know what he was doing behind closed doors. So yeah, I don't think it serves us to see these people as monsters. And he was not a monster, but he needed a lot of help that he didn't get.
And maybe didn't ask for the reasons you've talked about. I mean, there's a lovely scene in the second series where he, in just one scene, you see that he does love Bethan, but he does all these terrible things and he can't express himself. Anyway, that's the end of my questions, I think. Unless there's anything you want to add that you would like to tell social workers or other people.
I suppose, as I said, I don't know how things have changed, because it's been a while since I was going through it. But I know, maybe you can tell me. I don't know. There were lots of times police were called to my house for domestic violence situations, or various other things. Police would be called to my house, and as children, we were never pulled aside and asked if we were okay. It was never followed up with us. There was never any one-on-ones, and I wish someone had paid attention, and I hope they will going. I hope that is changing. That if police are called to a domestic violence situation in a home, that even if the mother decides not to press charges, that someone is following up with the kids. I don't know if that has changed, but it certainly never did in our case.
Well, I suppose there's pros and cons in terms of how things have changed. So I think the harm that domestic abuse can do to children is far more recognized now. So when I was a social worker in the 90s, we used to have this terrible, I mean, I just cannot believe we used to do this, that if we got referrals of domestic abuse, after the second one, we would write a letter to the parents basically saying, we've had this referral. If we have another one, we're going to come and visit you, which is almost like, it's almost like trying to tell the family to keep it quiet. I don't even know what was the system was trying to achieve, and me as part of the system as part of that. Much more recognition now. It's taken much more seriously, but I suppose the flip side of that is a lot more children are now in care because of domestic abuse issues, because it can be a very difficult one to work with, and as the depiction of Bethan's father shows, what do you do with a man like that? He's not really likely to change, probably, and he does some very bad things, and therefore a lot of protection can be to take kids into care. And that can also be very harmful. So whether we are getting the reaction right, I don't know. But I think we now at least recognize it's a big issue for kids. And it would be really interesting to have people who listen to this, practitioners and families and children, actually give their experiences, because I kind of don't know. I'm sure we haven't got it right yet. I do think we take it more seriously. But it's interesting that you mentioned that more than once, both at psychiatric hospital and with the police. And also with teachers in a different way, maybe just not connecting the dots, not talking to the child about what's happening, and seeing the child and the family as a whole, really. And maybe some of the take-home messages for professionals could be to listen to the child and try to connect the whole thing together.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to us. It's been a really, really good interview, and I got quite emotional remembering some of the scenes in My Skin, which is such a fantastic piece of work. For anyone who's listening or watching who hasn't seen it, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's wonderful. So thank you very much. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's been great talking to you.